Of all the deer in the forest, not one has lived half so long. That's why he's known as the great prince of the forest.
Bambi the book was published in 1928 and written by an Austrian author named Felix Salten. And actually he did 6 books, 3 of which were turned into Disney films, Bambi, Perry, and then The Hound of Florence, which became The Shaggy Dog.
How does a novel written by a man who works in an insurance office in Vienna, who's bored out of his mind and starts to write the story Bambi, how that gets to Disney is already an amazing story. And it involves, of course, World War II. It involves everything that's going on at that period.
Felix Salten's book came to Walt's attention by a fellow named Sidney Franklin in 1935. He was a producer and director of live-action films at MGM, and his films always had a great understanding of character and story and a lot of heart. Films like Goodbye Mr. Chips, Mrs. Miniver. Salten's book was a natural for Sidney Franklin. He optioned the film rights in 1933, and for a couple of years he played around with making an actual live-action version of the film.
Sidney Franklin liked the book very much, but he didn't think that it was possible to do a picture that had that much emotion with the animals.
So he realized the true medium for making Bambi would be animation, and my gosh, who better in the world to do this than Walt Disney, the king of animation. So he approached Walt Disney with the book.
And the book itself had a lot of poetry and beautiful scenes in it, and dramatic scenes. And when Walt heard about it and read the book and saw what the possibilities were, he became extremely enthused about it.
I think Walt was always somebody he was a nature guy. He liked nature, he liked the seasons, and he liked the outdoors.
And so from that aspect, I think it was very close to his heart, and one of the reasons why he poured so much of himself into it.
This is the kind of film he wanted to make, and it would be in advance. And so he risked everything. He was such a successful guy after Snow White, and he puts it all on the line again, immediately. I mean, who does that now? It's incredible, incredible.
In the early 1940s, they had already done the impossible. They made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They had done the next impossible, which is that they had made Fantasia and Pinocchio. The last thing they really needed to do was, like, outdo themselves, and yet they decided to push the envelope one bit forward.
That endless experimenting was very much Walt's personal style.
I always refer to the making of Snow White, where everybody was saying, you can't make a feature with animated cartoons. It's not going to work. A lot of people thought that, including animators. And when Walt came in and told the animators, he said, you know, my idea is...
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities.
This guy here, maybe he is grumpy. He'll be different. He's not just another little old man. He'll be a grumpy little old man. And then this man here, we'll make him sneezy, maybe. He'll sneeze.
This little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White.
By the time Walt got through telling him about his characters, everybody's saying, yeah, I think we could do that. Yeah. Well, that's how Walt was.
That kind of restless creativity that was never satisfied, that was always looking a couple of films ahead, I think is very clear in Bambi. And when you see the process by which it was developed, he's still experimenting and exploring and looking for, okay, where can we take this?
This great work of art, Bambi, came from the most chaotic time in the Disney studios. Really, the time that Bambi was in production, from about 1936 to its release in 1942, was a roller coaster ride for Disney in the studios. It was a very tumultuous time.
In 1939, the Nazis marched into Poland. The world was plunged into war. Disney lost their European market. Pinocchio did not make a profit.
It was somewhat of a scary time. I mean, there was a feeling of unease in Europe at that time, and financially things were not all that rosy.
And Walt ended up in debt to the Bank of America.
And he called over Mr. Giannini from the Bank of America, and he came over with his entourage of all the men in the dark suits, and they were all going to stand there and listen to Walt try to sell them on the idea of getting more money into this picture. And Walt started to tell the story. And I've never seen a man sell a story or an idea better than Walt. Walt was the greatest actor at that time. And I saw Mr. Giannini and his entourage watching all of this, enthralled with Walt and the story of Bambi. We got the money. Walt was the best salesman I'd ever seen. In fact, if I had the money, I would have invested in it.
And along about 1940, you have some labor unrest at the Disney studio. It was really a time of union organization, especially in the studios in Hollywood. And with the financial problems that Disney was facing, there were rumors rampant at the studio about potential layoffs. The Screen Cartoonists Guild was run by a real tough, hardline laborer named Herbert Sorrell, whose very name would bring most studio bosses to their knees. He went in with a meeting with Walt and said, you need to sign with me. Walt refused. He said, no, it's not my place to do that. I want to put this to a vote. I'll go with whatever my boys want. Sorrell had lost before on a vote, and I think he realized that he didn't have a majority of the artists. And he threatened Walt with a strike. Walt was adamant. He was not going to sign with Sorrell's union unless the boys voted it. Sorrell left, and the situation worsened. Tempers flared until on May 29th, 1941, Walt was surprised the studio had come under a strike.
Well, Bambi was still in the early stages of production and pre-production during the strike, but that was such a watershed in the history of the Disney studio and the history of animation that its impact was felt and still echoes down the decades. I don't know that any of the key artists on Bambi went out on the strike. They were in a different area physically.
We hardly knew that the strike was happening. And I naively just came into work every day.
My sympathy at that time was very much with Walt, when he realized who he was, the origin of his pictures, and to have it taken away from him by the strikes.
And then finally, they brought in a government mediator, and the government mediator settled the strike if Walt would take 2 strikers for every person that didn't go out on strike. And that's what happened to the studio.
Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We got in the Second World War.
The war had an enormous impact on the Disney studio.
The war turned our studio into a military reservation. All our facilities were devoted to making films for the war effort.
And actually, you know, the studio was taken over. So he survived that way.
By the time of Bambi's release in August of 1942, the world had been at war for almost 3 years, and the United States had been at war for 9 to 10 months.
I find it maybe an overlaying emotion to the picture, but the idea that it opened in August of 1942 during the war in London. The world premiere was in London, right in the middle of it all.
I mean, Bambi was much realer and intense dramatically than audiences might have been expecting from an animated film.
Well, as a matter of fact, Bambi didn't make a profit on the first release.
Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi all lost money initially. Since then, of course, they've gone on to reap millions, but it took those films a while to be recognized for what they were by the general public.
Walt should have been rewarded tremendously for Fantasia, for Dumbo, for Bambi, but the public was just simply on to global domination.
But Walt was the eternal optimist. Now, even though we have the deer facing trials and tribulations and the loss of his mother, ultimately everything ends up all right. And that was sort of what was going on at the studio, is here Walt was going through all the trials and tribulations of the strike, the financial problems in the war. And I think internally he was an optimist. He felt that everything would turn out right, and that was Bambi.
Bambi's a movie with great poetry and elegance and artistic integrity, but at its core is something very emotional. And of course, that's Disney storytelling at its best.
This world could use some of the messages, that little beautiful story of Bambi.
A film like Bambi will never get old. It's timeless.
It really stands alone as one of, the great motion pictures ever made.
People talk about the philosophies, the art value, the animation, and the styling of that picture as being the epitome of the art of animation. Glad to have been part of that.